Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's Garage. In today's video, I'm changing the coolant temp sensor and thermostat on a 2000 Volvo 2.4T. I'm not familiar with the differences between this and the 2.4T in the 850s, the naturally aspirated 2.4, or the later engines in the P2 cars. So if you have one of those, this may serve as more of a guide, but if you have the late generation P80 cars, this will be a great video to watch. I did have a couple problems with this. Hopefully you don't. You probably won't. It's related to the previous owner of the car, so I will be covering it here, but chances are you won't have to worry about it. Before we get started, I just want to cover what you'll need. Obviously, a coolant temp sensor and thermostat. I always like to go with OEM or OEM equivalent here. They're critical components, and I don't really want to mess around with them failing. I have replacement thermostat housing bolts. You'll see why further on in the video. Pinch-off pliers are really helpful for reducing the amount of coolant you lose through the hose. A 7mm socket. A T40 driver bit. The longer the better. You'll also see why there's some clearance issues with getting those bolts out. Ratchets. 19mm wrench. Some extra coolant. Lastly, an impact driver and a hammer. Those items are optional. Hopefully you don't need them. I had problems with the bolts. You'll see later on in the video. I just wanted to start off by showing why I bought that extra long Torx bit. The bit that I have was too large, and so it would hit the engine, and I couldn't get a straight on shot for that inner thermostat housing bolt. The extra long one provided all the clearance I needed. I don't need an entire set of extra long bits like this, so I just bought this single one off eBay. It was at my house in a couple days. Really no problems. Starting off with the actual work, I do highly suggest you pick up a pack of these pinch-off pliers. You can get them at your local car parts store. It comes in a pack of 3. They're only a few dollars, and it saves a huge mess from this upper hose. Otherwise, it's going to dump coolant everywhere. It's just not worth it. Go pick them up, pinch off the hose, remove the hose clamp, pull the hose off the thermostat housing, and then we can get to removing the bolts for the housing itself. As you can see, my problems begin with the inner thermostat housing bolt. I've removed thermostat housings on a bunch of different cars, and the bolts should never be that tight. The outer bolt cracked loose right away, and so that inner bolt I was really suspicious of. It was a little stripped to begin with, and it was just way too tight. I initially ground some flat spots into the bolt and tried to use vice grips or a wrench to crack it loose, and that didn't work. That's when I turned to the hammer and the impact driver. An impact driver is not constant torque. You know, if you've ever used one or even an impact gun, it's that jolt of force, and that's usually why it can crack bolts loose versus the constant force of a ratchet or a wrench is going to strip something. I was really careful when using the impact driver. I didn't want to turn this into a bigger problem than it already seemed to be. My goal was to extract the bolt, not to pull threads out and have to re-tap it or anything like that. I will say it's a good thing I'm doing a voiceover here because that raw audio would get me kicked off YouTube. I was really mad when that bolt finally came out. You can see the RTV on the threads, but I'm pretty sure they also used Loctite to secure that bolt. RTV just seals something. Loctite will secure it and keep it from coming out. Hopefully you don't have this problem. If you do, please let me know because the same person probably worked on both of our cars. With the bolts out, the thermostat housing should lift right off the top, and the thermostat itself should come out fairly easily. Sometimes it's a little corroded or gunked up and you gotta give it just a little elbow grease, but in my case there was some RTV, a lot of corrosion, and I had to end up using a screwdriver. Again, hopefully you don't have this problem. If you do, be really careful with the screwdriver. You don't want to damage anything else. But hopefully you don't have this problem and it's smooth sailing and everything I've previously talked about isn't an issue. If you do have any corrosion or gunk around the edge of that thermostat housing, you do want to clean it up. You want a nice smooth surface for that to seal against. Otherwise you could end up with a small leak, and that's the last thing you want to chase around. I use a screwdriver and razor blade to clean the surface, but you have to be really careful if you do that because you can mar the aluminum and then not get a good seal. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can use something like a plastic scraper instead. You also want to make sure that none of this is floating around in the coolant. That's what you see me doing with the paper towel there. I'm just dabbing it out. Nothing's big enough to really clog anything or cause a problem, but you don't want any foreign objects floating around in the coolant. Next, using a 19mm wrench, you can remove the coolant temp sensor. Kind of like an O2 sensor, your best bet is to crack it loose and then disconnect the plug and wind it out by hand. It's always a good idea to compare your old parts to your new parts. Make sure what you're putting in is the same as what you took out. In this case, the OEM versus aftermarket thermostat looks different, but the sizes are all the same and it'll function the same. When installing your new coolant temp sensor, you want to start it by hand and then just snug it up with the wrench. You want to make sure that that crush washer engages and makes a seal, but you don't want to over tighten it and damage something. Then you can plug it back in and re-secure it. Mine was secured with a zip tie when I took it off, so that's what I redid. I don't know if it came differently from the factory. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Either way, you have to break it to unplug it, so a zip tie is a great solution to re-secure it. Next, you can go ahead and reinstall your thermostat. If you are using an OEM Volvo thermostat, it'll have a little weep hole in it, and that should be towards the front of the vehicle. Other non-OEM thermostats won't have this, but if you do, make sure it's oriented to the front. Go ahead and reinstall the housing cover, and please, for the love of whoever's going to work on your car next, don't use RTV, Loctite, anything like that you saw earlier in the video. Just tighten the bolts. That should be enough to seal it. If it's not, give it another quarter turn, and it should be fine. Reinstall the upper radiator hose, tighten your hose clamp, and at this point, bring the car up to operating temperature while idling in your driveway. This serves a few different functions. 1, you're bleeding the cooling system, making sure that the level is correct and there's no air bubbles in there. 2, you can check for leaks on the newly installed parts. And 3, you can check the function of the thermostat itself, making sure that it's opening when the car gets hot. If you have any questions about those items, please leave a comment. I'm happy to help. Thanks so much for checking out this video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I try to answer everyone. If you found this video helpful, check out some of my other videos, and don't forget to subscribe.